Hi everyone, this is the starter activity for today's lesson. You have 3 questions about cardiovascular disease and blood vessels. So pause the video here to answer those and then come back and I'll go through the answers. Okay, so hopefully you guys have answered those 3 questions now. I'm just going to go through the answers. So number 1, what is cardiovascular disease? It is any disease that affects the heart. Okay, so cardiovascular diseases affect the heart. What are the effects of cardiovascular disease? So you can have high blood cholesterol, you can have damaged arteries, you can have blood clots, and these things can lead to heart attacks. Okay, so number 3, what is the difference between a capillary and a vein? Okay, so a vein returns blood back towards the heart. And a capillary surrounds body cells to deliver and absorb nutrients and oxygen. Okay, so a vein returns blood back towards the heart, a capillary surrounds body cells and tissues to deliver and absorb nutrients and oxygen, and then just a bonus here, an artery transports blood away from the heart. Okay, so a vein returns blood to the heart, artery takes blood away from the heart, and a capillary surrounds the body cells to deliver the oxygen. Okay, so give yourselves a mark out of 3 for each of those, and then we'll move on to today's lesson. So today the lesson is about the heart and the circulatory system. Your learning objective for today is to describe and explain the blood flow through the double circulatory system using the correct anatomy of the heart. So we're going to look at the double circulatory system, the blood flow, and the structure of the heart. Your keywords for today are double circulatory system, pulmonary, aorta, vena cava, atrium, and ventricle. So first we're going to look at blood and the circulatory system as a transport system. So our circulatory system is like a road network. It allows the transport of substances from one place to another. The blood travels through the circulatory system carrying food and oxygen to every cell in the body. And as well as a delivery system, it also acts as a waste collection service. It carries waste products to where they can be removed from the body. We need a transport system like this as we are fairly large organisms and we have a small surface area to volume ratio. The The circulatory system is made up of the heart, blood vessels, and blood. As humans, we have a double circulatory system, which means we have two circuits working together. So the first circuit is up here. We call it the pulmonary circuit, and that's because it involves the lungs. So the right ventricle pumps deoxygenated blood to the lungs to take in oxygen, and then the blood returns to the heart as oxygenated blood. So as we can see in this picture, the blue arrow is deoxygenated blood coming from the heart going towards the lungs, and then coming out of the lungs we have oxygenated blood that goes back into the heart. So that's the pulmonary circuit. And then our second circuit is the systemic circuit, which is this bottom one in the picture. The left ventricle pumps oxygenated blood around the body. The blood gives its oxygen to the body cells and returns to the heart to be pumped back into the lungs again. So as we can see in the picture, the oxygenated blood comes out of the heart here, goes towards the body cells, and then comes out of the body cells as deoxygenated blood back into the heart, where the circuit will start again to go into the pulmonary circuit. Okay, so both of these circuits work together so that we have deoxygenated blood and oxygenated blood in the right places in our body. Okay, so review 1 for this lesson has 4 questions in it. I'd like you to pause the video here to answer these 4 questions, and then I'll go through the answers in a second. Okay, so hopefully you've answered those 4 questions now. I will go through the answers. Number 1, what does the term double circulatory system mean? And it means we have 2 circuits working together to pump blood around the body. Number 2, what is the circulatory system made up of? The answer is the heart, blood vessels, and blood. Okay, so the circulatory system is made up of the heart, blood vessels, and blood. Number 3, what does the blood carry to the cells of the body? The answer is oxygen. Okay, and number 4, why do humans need a transport system like this? And the answer is we are fairly large organisms, and we have a small surface area to volume ratio. Okay, so we need a transport system like this because we are fairly large organisms and we have a small surface area to volume ratio. So give yourselves a mark out of 4 for review 1, and then we'll move on to the next part of the lesson. Okay, so next we're going to look at the heart. So the heart is made up of cardiac muscle that contracts to pump blood around the body. It has 4 chambers. They are called the left atrium, the right atrium, the left ventricle, and the right ventricle, as you can see on this picture. There are valves in the heart to make sure the blood flows in the right direction and prevent blood flowing backwards. And as you can see on this picture, the right atrium and the right ventricle are blue because that's where the deoxygenated blood is, and the left atrium and left ventricle are red because that's where the oxygenated blood is. Okay, so now let's look at the structure of the heart. You may have noticed that when you're looking at pictures of a heart, the right and the left are the wrong way round. We say them this way round because we imagine this diagram as though we were stood opposite it. The muscle on the left side is thicker, so that's this side here. Is thicker because the left ventricle has to pump blood all around the body at a higher pressure, and the right side has a thinner muscle because that ventricle only has to pump blood to the lungs, which is much closer. Okay, so let's look at this diagram here with all the labels. So let's start by here. This is the vena cava. That is the vein that brings deoxygenated blood into the right atrium, which is here. This tricuspid valve here closes like this until the blood is ready to be pushed from the right atrium into the right ventricle. The right ventricle is this chamber down here. And then the deoxygenated blood in the right ventricle gets pushed out this valve here, then opens. That valve is called the semilunar valve. Okay, so when the right ventricle contracts, the semilunar valve opens and the deoxygenated blood is pushed out to the pulmonary artery, which goes to the lungs. And then when the blood comes back from the lungs, it comes back into the heart through the pulmonary vein over here into the left atrium. So remember, now the blood is oxygenated, so this is the red side of the heart. When the blood is in the atrium, this valve, which is called the bicuspid valve, is closed, and then when the blood moves from the left atrium into the left ventricle, the bicuspid valve will open, the blood will move into the left ventricle, which is here, and then the valve will close again. When the left ventricle contracts, the semilunar valve will open and the blood will be pushed out through the aorta, which is an artery that takes the blood around the body. And the only bit we haven't looked at is the septum by here. So that's the bit that divides the chambers in the middle of the heart. Okay, so here's review 2. There are 5 questions, so pause the video here to answer those, and then I'll go through the answers. Okay, hopefully you've given those 5 questions a go. Now we're going to write the answers in. So number 1, what is the heart made up of? The answer is cardiac muscle. Number 2, how many chambers does the heart have? The answer is 4. Number 3, what are the chambers of the heart called? Left atrium, left ventricle, right atrium, right ventricle. Okay, so number 4, what are the valves used for? To prevent blood flowing backwards and we call that backflow. So if I mention backflow later on in the lesson, it means blood flowing backwards. Number 5, why is the muscle of the left side thicker than the right side? And the answer is the left side has to pump blood to the whole body. The right side only has to pump blood to the lungs. Okay, and obviously the lungs are a lot closer to the heart than the rest of the body, so the left side has to have a thicker muscle to push the blood a further distance at a high pressure. Okay, so give yourself a mark out of 5 for review 2, and we'll move on to the next part of the lesson. Okay, so now we have another review. I would like you to label this diagram of the heart. It's the same diagram I talked you through earlier in the lesson. So I'd like you to put each of the parts of the heart in the numbered boxes. So pause the video here to do that, and then I'll talk you through the answers in a second. Okay, so hopefully you attempted that. There are 11 labels. So let's go through the answers now. Number 1 is the pulmonary artery. So that's the artery that takes the blood to the lungs. Number 2 is the aorta, which is also an artery, and that artery takes blood to the rest of the body. Number 3 is the pulmonary vein. So that brings the blood back to the heart from the lungs. Number 4 is the left atrium. Number 5 is the bicuspid valve. Number 6 is the left ventricle. Number 7 is the right ventricle. Number 8 is the septum. Just remember that separated the chambers of the heart so that the oxygenated and deoxygenated blood wouldn't touch. Number 9 is the tricuspid valve. Number 10 is the right atrium. And number 11 is the vena cava, which brings the deoxygenated blood back from the body back into the heart. And then one thing that isn't labelled on here are these valves in the middle, which we call the semi-lunar valves. Okay, so both of those are called semi-lunar valves, and they open when the blood is pushed into the artery. Okay, so give yourselves a mark out of 11 and a bonus mark if you label the semi-lunar valves as well. And then we'll move on to the next part of the lesson. Okay, so now we're going to move on to blood flow and look at how the blood moves through the heart. I've mentioned it briefly, but now we're going to look at it in detail. So this is step 1. The deoxygenated blood from the head and the body enters the right atrium via the vena cava. So this is the vena cava by here, and as you can see, blood is flowing in downwards from the head and upwards from the lower part of the body, and the blood goes into the right atrium, and this side of the heart is blue because it's deoxygenated blood. So that's step 1. Moving on to step 2. The right atrium contracts, the tricuspid valve opens, and the deoxygenated blood passes into the right ventricle. Okay, so the blood goes from here, this valve opens, and it can go into the right ventricle. Then the right ventricle will contract, which pushes the blood upwards to here. The semilunar valve will then open, and the blood goes up through the pulmonary artery to the lungs, and in the lungs the blood will become oxygenated. The semilunar valve and the tricuspid valve closes after the blood has been pumped to the lungs, and that prevents backflow. And step 3 takes place when the blood comes back from the lungs. So it travels back in from the lungs through the pulmonary vein. It is now oxygenated, which is why that side of the heart looks red. So oxygenated blood from the lungs enters the left atrium, and it's via the pulmonary vein. So that's step 3. Okay, and then step 4, the left atrium contracts, the bicuspid valve opens by here. The blood moves into the left ventricle. The bicuspid valve then closes to prevent backflow. The left ventricle then contracts. The semilunar valves open, and the oxygenated blood is pumped around the body via the aorta. The semilunar valve closes once the blood has left the ventricle to prevent backflow. The cells in the body take the oxygen from the blood. It then returns from the head and the rest of the body into the vena cava, and then the circuit repeats. We're back to stage 1. So that happens every time our heart beats. Deoxygenated blood comes in and out of the right side of the heart, and oxygenated blood comes in and out of the left side of the heart. So here's a summary to show all 4 steps together. Our blood comes from the head and the rest of the body into the vena cava by here, which goes into the right atrium. Then step 2, the right atrium will contract, causing the tricuspid valves to open. The blood will move into the right ventricle. The tricuspid valve will then close to prevent backflow. The right ventricle will then contract. The semilunar valve will open, and the blood will be pushed into the pulmonary artery and taken to the lungs, where it gets oxygenated. The semilunar valve closes once the blood has been pushed out to prevent backflow. Step 3, oxygenated blood comes from the lungs and enters the left atrium via the pulmonary vein. And then step 4, the left atrium will contract, the bicuspid valve will open, and the oxygenated blood will be pushed into the left ventricle. The left ventricle will then contract, the semilunar valve will open, and blood will be pushed into the aorta and taken to the rest of the body. Then once the body cells have taken the oxygen from the blood will return as deoxygenated into the vena cava over there, and then the cycle repeats as this is step 1 again. Okay, so now I'd like you to pause the video here and fill in this gap fill. There is a word bank in your class notebook assignment to help you out with this, so give all of the words a go, and then we'll go through the answers in a second. Okay, so here are the answers to the word fill. So I'll read the whole paragraph out, and the words in red are the correct answers. So deoxygenated blood from the head and the body enters the right atrium via the vena cava. the right atrium contracts, the tricuspid valve opens, and the deoxygenated blood passes into the right ventricle. The right ventricle contracts, the semilunar valve opens, and the deoxygenated blood is pumped into the lungs, where it becomes oxygenated. The semilunar valve and the tricuspid valve close after the blood has been pumped to the lungs. Oxygenated blood from the lungs enters the left atrium via the pulmonary vein. The left atrium contracts, the bicuspid valve opens, and the oxygenated blood moves into the left ventricle. The bicuspid valve closes to prevent backflow. The left ventricle contracts, the semilunar valve opens, and the oxygenated blood is pumped around the body via the aorta. The semilunar valve closes once the blood has left the ventricle. The cells in the body take oxygen from the blood. It returns from the body and the head into the right atrium via the vena cava, and then the circuit repeats. So give yourself a tick for each word you got right there, and then we'll move on. Okay, so the next thing we're going to look at is how the muscle and the cells in the heart get their blood supply. So blood is supplied to the cardiac muscle by the coronary arteries, which branch from the base of the aorta. They allow the oxygen and glucose needed for respiration to diffuse into the cardiac muscle cells in the thick heart wall. The muscle contraction of the heart requires energy, so if these muscle cells don't get energy from respiration, then the heart can't contract to pump blood around the body. So these coronary arteries are very important because they supply oxygen to the muscle cells in the heart. The muscles in the heart contract faster during exercise because the cells of the body need oxygen more quickly. This is called an increased heart rate. When we are resting, the heart rate is decreased as the cells in the body don't need oxygen as quickly, and this is called our resting heart rate. The classic lub-dub sound of the heartbeat is the noise of the heart contracting. Okay, so this is the last review of this lesson, review 5. There are 3 questions about blood supply to the heart and heart rate. So pause the video here, answer these 3 questions, and then I'll go through the answers. Okay, so hopefully you've answered those 3 questions. I'll write the answers in now. Question 1, what arteries supply blood to the cardiac muscle? Coronary. Number 2, why is it essential that the cardiac muscle gets enough oxygen? And that's because the muscle in the heart cannot contract to pump blood around the body without oxygen or respiration. Okay, so it's essential that the cardiac muscle gets enough oxygen because the muscle in the heart cannot contract to pump blood around the body without the oxygen that's needed for respiration. And number 3, what happens to the heart rate when exercising? And the answer there is it increases. Okay, so give yourself a mark out of 3 for review 5. And now I've set you 2 exam questions. They're in your class notebook assignment for this lesson. So the first question is about the double circulatory system, the structure of the heart, and about backflow. And then the second question is a QWC question, and it wants you to explain the blood flow through the heart, how it goes from the right ventricle to the left atrium. So we've covered all of that in this lesson, so you should be able to answer these questions. Once you have answered them, can you please hand in your class notebook assignment? So yeah, that's it for today's lesson. So thanks for watching, guys.